Everything feels distant now, like a base settling into its night cycle. The story ahead drifts in at that same slow rhythm. Let's step into it. The moon had no weather in the old sense, only the slow movement of powdered ice across metal when the ventilation stacks exhaled. It looked like snow if you stood far enough away and wanted it to. Up close, it was ground glass and pale grit, drifting in thin arcs around pipe supports and antenna masts. It collected in the seams of bulkheads and in the corners of service gantries where nobody went unless something had already broken. On shift rotations, the refinery lights stayed constant to keep people from thinking about time. The same sodium glow, the same cold white floodlights around the tower, the same red warning beacons that never turned off because someone decided long ago that a steady alarm felt safer than an alarm that started suddenly. I arrived after the first failure, when everyone was already speaking in half measures. They said there had been a surge. They said a control manifold had stuck. They said a pressure relief system had cycled too hard and cracked a line. They said there was no breach, no core exposure, no reason to disrupt production beyond the affected sector. They said it with the calm tone officers use when they want their calm to be contagious. I had heard that tone on troop carriers after hull strikes. I had heard it in infirmary corridors when the medtechs were triaging in silence. The words change. The tone does not. My designation in the attachment roster was Rook 17, Combat Engineer, Containment and Breaching, seconded to Industrial Defense because the refinery was a strategic node. In practice, it meant I did the jobs that didn't fit on the neat lines of a mission brief. I sealed ruptures. I cut through locked doors. I moved through places designed for machines, not bodies. When the shuttle set down on the outer pad, the airlock cycle carried the taste of metal into my mouth before the inner hatch even opened. That taste wasn't oxygen. It was particulate in the recycle stream, fine enough to get past cheap filters, heavy enough to stick to the tongue. It left a copper edge along the back of the throat. The first thing I saw after stepping onto the deck was a line of workers walking toward the transit tunnel, shoulders hunched, heads down, all of them moving too fast for people who weren't supposed to be afraid. They weren't running. It was worse than running. It was the controlled pace of people trying to convince themselves they still had control. Their suits were industrial, thin and padded, meant for cold and sharp edges, not for radiation. Some of them had hoods down. Some were barefaced. Their skin looked normal from a distance. Up close, on the ones who passed near enough, I could see the mottling at the cheeks, the dry cracking at the lips, the way their eyes kept refocusing as if the light was too bright. The official on the pad met my team with a clipboard and a sealed helmet, like the helmet was a courtesy. The clipboard had the usual numbers, exposure time limits, allowable dose ranges, lists of areas marked restricted. The restricted zones were small on the map, drawn like neat wounds that could be bandaged. Behind him, the reactor tower rose like a black spine. It was still lit, which meant someone somewhere was pretending everything inside was stable enough to keep power flowing. Along one side of the tower, a vertical run of venting had frozen into an uneven icicle of coolant vapor. It clung to the structure like a pale tumor, curling outward into vacuum in slow, delicate sheets. My suit systems came online with their familiar weight. The exosuit was A2 vintage, patched at the elbows and knees, its sealing gaskets replaced more times than I could count. It made my breathing louder. It made my joints feel heavier. It also meant I could stand in places where the air itself was trying to kill me and still move my hands with precision. I checked my dosimeter array out of habit. It ticked once, twice, nothing unusual. Then it ticked again, too quickly to be static. The numbers climbed, then stabilized at a level they'd call elevated but tolerable, the kind of reading you could build a narrative around. I didn't believe narratives, I believed trends. Inside the administrative corridor, the walls were lined with screens showing live feeds from processing floors. The feeds had timestamps. The timestamps were wrong by several minutes. Someone had built a delay into them, the way you delay a broadcast to cut out something you don't want seen. In the briefing room, the refinery's local commanders stood in front of an overlay map and spoke in clipped phrases. Stabilization measures, sector isolation, controlled venting, no confirmed breach. The words were clean. My team was a small one. 3 engineers, 2 drones, 1 medic who had been repurposed from infantry support because infantry support was where medics went to die slowly in transit. We listened, and we kept our faces blank because showing emotion in a room like that only gave the system something to push against. A senior technical advisor joined via a narrowband link from orbit, his feed grainy and desaturated. He did not waste time with reassurance. He talked about heat fronts and containment geometry. He talked about neutron flux and the way a compact pile behaves when you starve it of coolant and then flood it again. He said there was a non-zero chance the core had burned through its cradle. The local commander dismissed it with a reference to on-site instruments. The advisor didn't argue. He simply asked for raw telemetry. The request hung in the room like a knife nobody wanted to touch. Raw telemetry was a thing that existed in theory. In practice, it was filtered, averaged, and cleaned until it fit the story that kept the lights on. The briefing ended with orders that weren't orders. We were told to assist with containment. We were told to stay within mapped safe corridors. We were told evacuation was being considered. We were told the workers being transferred were injured by heat and mechanical impact, not by exposure. In the transit tunnel, the air tasted worse. We passed a med bay that had been converted from a maintenance alcove. The door was open a handspan, enough for the smell to leak out. It smelled like antiseptic and vomit. Inside, I saw a stretcher being pushed into a sealed lift, the patient covered from neck to toe. The medic pushing it kept his eyes down. His gloves were stained dark. The lift doors shut. The corridor cameras did not swivel. They didn't need to. They were already pointed away. I logged everything into my suit core. Not because I thought anyone would read it, because logging was what I did when the world stopped making honest sense. It was a way of leaving a trail through fog. Our first assignment was the lower processing hall, where the coolant return lines ran like arteries along the floor and disappeared into bulkhead penetrations. The hall was a cathedral of industrial architecture, tall columns, hanging conduits, graded walkways above. The floor was slick with frozen condensate. In places it had turned black, as if something hot had kissed it and then gone away. We moved slow. Every step in exosuit boots made a dull impact that traveled up the leg braces and into my spine. The sound echoed. There was no chatter in the comms. The channel was technically open, but it felt watched. My micro-drone crawled ahead, its camera feed painting the corridor in shades of gray. At first, it showed nothing but pipes, frost, and the occasional dropped tool. Then it showed a worker slumped against a bulkhead, helmet off, mouth open as if he'd been trying to breathe more air than the room could give him. He wasn't dead yet. I could tell by the slow movement of his chest. His eyes tracked the drone with the dull curiosity of someone who had already moved past fear into something quieter. We didn't stop. Not because we were cruel, because stopping meant exposure time, and exposure time meant we might not reach the place we were supposed to reach. And if we didn't reach it, more people would die than the ones slumped in the corridor. That was how these missions always worked. You traded a known body for an unknown number. At the first junction, my dosimeter ticked faster. The numbers climbed in a staircase pattern, each step sharp. My suit's radiation alarms tried to sound, but they were set to a threshold that could be adjusted by policy. Policy had adjusted them upward. We reached the return manifold and found it warped. The metal had softened and then resolidified, leaving ripples like melted wax. The insulation foam around it was charred. A thin haze hung in the air, a shimmer that the suit optics struggled to correct. It wasn't smoke. It was aerosolized coolant and metal oxides, particles suspended in the thin, recycled air. The second engineer sprayed sealant foam into a fracture and watched it bubble and harden. The foam was designed to resist heat and pressure. It was not designed for radiation. Radiation doesn't burn through things the way fire does. It changes them. It makes them brittle in ways you don't see until they fail. While the others worked, I placed a contact sensor on the manifold and watched the readout. The temperature gradient wasn't normal. It wasn't cooling as it should. It was as if something below was feeding heat upward. I thought about the advisor's phrase, burned through its cradle. Above us, somewhere in the tower, the core was either intact or it wasn't. If it wasn't, the heat wasn't just heat. It was a process continuing inside the structure, eating. We filed our report. It went into the comms buffer. It stayed there longer than it should have. Hours passed in pieces. We moved from sector to sector, sealing lines, deploying drones, mapping hot zones that didn't match the official map. Every time we logged a reading that exceeded tolerable levels, the response came back with instructions to recalibrate, to verify, to avoid alarmism. The language of denial is always procedural. It hides behind the idea of rigor. In the transit hub, I watched more workers move through. This time, some of them were carried. 2 men in industrial suits supported a third between them, his feet dragging. His helmet was on, visor down, but his hands were bare and his fingers twitched in small, useless motions. His suit's sleeves were rolled up, exposing forearms mottled with red and purple patches. They weren't evacuating the workforce. They were evacuating the evidence. Then the independent confirmation arrived, and it arrived the way truth often does in military systems, not through admission, but through a machine that couldn't be intimidated. A reconnaissance drone launched from orbit and made a low pass over the tower. Its sensors were hardened, its telemetry encrypted outside local control. The data packet hit our suit cores at the same time it hit command, an automatic broadcast to all authorized units. The images were clean, too clean, almost clinical. They showed the tower's internal heat signature bleeding downward in a shape that did not match any designed pathway. They showed a bloom of radiation that spread like ink in water through the lower foundations. They showed the reactor's heart not as a point, but as a ragged wound. The drone's own sensors began to fail as it passed the hottest zone. Its feed degraded into static and then cut out entirely. A machine had flown into the truth and been blinded by it. After that, the tone changed without anyone acknowledging it had been wrong before. Evacuation began. Not announced as evacuation, announced as precautionary relocation due to industrial hazard. The transports were not enough. They never are. People were prioritized by role, by rank, by how replaceable they were on paper. Local administrators who had been speaking the calm tone were pulled aside by security teams and placed in restraints. Their crime wasn't the failure. It was obstruction. It was falsifying telemetry. It was keeping the story smooth while bodies accumulated in corridors. I watched one of them being led past the hub, his face pale, his jaw clenched. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man who had spent his life believing that control was the same thing as safety. My suit core logged that too. It logged the way the security team's gloves left streaks of frost on his sleeves. It logged the way he didn't resist, as if resistance required believing the system could still be negotiated with. That was when the advisor's second message came through, compressed and coded, routed through channels that local command couldn't filter quickly enough. It wasn't about the core anymore. It was about what sat beneath it. He had pulled old construction records from archived war-era plans, the kind of plans that got buried when a facility was repurposed and leadership decided the past was irrelevant. Beneath the modern reactor cradle, beneath the layers of reinforcement and ice-insulated foundations, there was a cavity. an energy storage chamber built to feed mass drivers during a siege that had never happened. It held dense storage cells and transfer conduits designed for output spikes that would make a compact pile look gentle. If the breach front reached that cavity, if the heat and radiation compromised the storage geometry, it would not be a localized explosion. It would be a detonation that would fracture the moon's upper crust. Under that crust, the basin held pressurized brine and trapped gases, the legacy of a younger world that never fully froze. Crack it open, and you didn't just lose a refinery. You created a vent to vacuum that would strip the basin clean and throw a plume of debris into orbital lanes. It would turn the moon into shrapnel and vapor. Command did not call it that. They called it a potential secondary event. They called it a risk to strategic assets. They called it unacceptable. They approved an operation. The operation had no name that mattered. It was a set of coordinates and a time window. It was a list of required actions that read like a manual, written by someone who would not be present to feel the heat through metal. A small team would enter the lower foundations through service shafts that were already above lethal dose. They would reach the buried cavity's access manifold. They would isolate transfer conduits manually. They would deploy sealant foam and clamp arrays to sever the system from the breach zone. They would do it fast enough that the heat front didn't arrive while they were still inside. They sent combat engineers because combat engineers were trained to work under fire, and radiation was just another kind of fire that didn't make noise. My designation was on the roster before I acknowledged it. The medic's designation was not. He was reassigned to evacuation triage. That was how the system chose who would die, not by heroism, by specialty. We moved to the service shaft entrance at the base of the tower, where a maintenance hatch stood open like a mouth. The air that came out of it was warmer than it should have been on a frozen moon. It carried the smell of burned insulation and something else underneath, a sweet chemical edge that my suit filters flagged as degraded coolant. My dosimeter clicked steadily now, no longer in bursts. The numbers were in the range where time became a resource you spent consciously, like ammunition. I checked my suit seals again. The left forearm gasket had a micro-tear, too small to matter in cold air, too large to ignore in a contaminated shaft. I patched it with sealant tape and told myself it would hold long enough. Telling yourself things is another kind of procedure. The shaft descended in a spiral metal stairs bolted to the inner wall. The lights along it were intermittent, some dead, some flickering as if struggling to decide whether power still belonged to them. My suit's lamp cut through the darkness in a narrow cone, revealing frost on the steps and blackened streaks along the wall where heat had licked upward. Halfway down, my micro-drone lost signal. It didn't fail dramatically, it simply stopped responding, its feed freezing on a frame of darkness. The suit registered it as offline, a clean word for something that had been cooked from the inside out. We continued without it. At the bottom, the shaft opened into a utility corridor that ran beneath the tower's foundation. The corridor was narrower than modern design would allow. Its walls were older, rougher, lined with conduit runs that had been installed by hands, not drones. In places, the metal had buckled. In others, it was coated with a fine, crystalline dust that glittered in my lamp beam. The dust was not ice. It was fallout, condensed and settled. My suit's internal temperature control struggled. It had been built for cold. Here, beneath the tower, the heat gradient was wrong. It rose from below as if the moon itself had a fever. We reached an intersection where the floor had cracked, a jagged seam running across it. Through the seam, I could see darkness and a faint shimmer, as if gas was moving in slow currents. The air smelled sharper here, like ozone and burnt wire. The second engineer designation, Coil 9 in the roster, though I never used it in my head, stepped wrong on a slick patch and went down hard. The impact rang through the corridor. His suit hit the floor and slid a half-meter before stopping against a conduit run. He didn't get up immediately. I watched the seconds pass. My dosimeter kept clicking. When he moved, it was slow. His left leg brace had taken the brunt. The suit's diagnostic flashed amber, joint actuator strain, potential hydraulic leak. He rose anyway, because rising was still possible, and possible was all we had. We reached the buried cavity access manifold after another 5 minutes of descent and turns through corridors that weren't on the modern map. The manifold was a circular hatch inset into the floor, surrounded by a ring of thick conduits that ran outward like spokes. The hatch had a war-era insignia stamped into it, worn but still visible. Someone had once expected to open it under fire. The heat here was intense enough that frost didn't form on metal edges. Instead, the metal sweated, condensation beating and then evaporating before it could drip. The air shimmered constantly. My suit alarm finally sounded, not because policy allowed it, but because the dose rate exceeded even the adjusted threshold. It was a dull tone, almost polite, as if apologizing for interrupting. We set to work. There was no elegance to the task. We placed clamp arrays on the transfer conduits at designated intervals. We injected sealant foam into joints to prevent backflow. We used the plasma cutter to sever a conduit that had already warped, its surface glowing faintly under the lamp. The plasma cutter's light was harsh white. It reflected off the dust crystals in the air and made them sparkle like false stars. The cut metal hissed and spat. The smell of hot iron filled my suit filters until they complained. Every movement was slow, not for drama, but because rushing in an exosuit in a narrow corridor gets you killed by your own weight. The suit amplified my strength, but it also amplified mistakes. Coil 9's leg actuator began to fail. The amber diagnostic turned red. His suit compensation system shifted load to the other leg. He kept working, one-sided and rigid, the way injured soldiers keep firing because stopping feels like dying. The third engineer designation, Ash 4, handled the clamp arrays with steady hands. I watched his gloves, the way they moved with practiced precision. He was younger than me, but his movements had the same economy. That meant he'd been tired for a long time. Above us, through layers of ice and metal, the core breach continued to burn. We couldn't see it. We could feel it in the way the corridor grew warmer by degrees. The advisor's calculations had given us a window. The window was closing. When we finished the last conduit siever, there was a moment of silence that felt unnatural, as if the corridor itself was waiting to see if we had done enough. Then the floor vibrated. It wasn't a quake. It was a deep mechanical tremor, a resonance passing through structure. Somewhere above, something heavy shifted. The corridor lights dimmed and flared. Dust drifted down from a seam in the ceiling. My suit registered a pressure fluctuation, a slow drop. That meant a leak had opened somewhere. Vacuum was finding its way into the foundations. We began to move back toward the shaft, not running. Running would waste oxygen and break ankles. We moved with the same slow urgency we had used to work, because slow urgency was the only kind that lasted. Halfway back, we reached the cracked seam in the floor again. The seam was wider now. The darkness beneath it was no longer still. Gas moved in visible swirls, carrying dust upward in a thin stream. Ash 4 stepped over it first. His boot landed on the far side. The metal there held for a heartbeat, then buckled downward with a sound like a groan. He dropped, not straight down. The floor gave way at an angle, and his suit slid into the gap, wedged at the torso. His arms flailed once, then locked as his suit tried to stabilize. The gap's edges bit into his armor plating. I went to him without thinking. Thinking came after. I grabbed his upper brace and pulled. The suit servos whined. The gap's edges held him like teeth. The dose rate here spiked, my dosimeter going frantic. Coil 9 tried to help, but his leg actuator failed fully and he slammed to one knee, his suit compensators screaming in my comms channel as they fought to keep him upright. Ash 4's suit diagnostics flashed on my visor through the link: seal breach, pressure loss, filtration overload. The gap beneath him vented cold vacuum air through the corridor, dragging heat and dust with it. The stream made a thin, screaming sound around the metal edges. There was no way to pull him free without cutting the floor around him, and cutting would take time we did not have. Time wasn't just exposure. Time was pressure dropping. Time was the breach front moving. Time was the tower above settling into collapse. Ash 4's gloved hand reached up and found my forearm brace. His grip was strong, then weak, then strong again. His visor was opaque with dust. I couldn't see his eyes. My suit's oxygen timer ticked down. My radiation timer was no longer a number I could pretend to manage. I logged the moment. I logged the pressure reading. I logged the fact of his entrapment. Logging was what I did when there was no solution. I forced my hands to release him. I moved. Coil 9 rose with a jerking motion, his suit dragging his damaged leg like dead weight. We left Ash 4 in the gap, wedged and venting. The corridor's sound changed as we moved away, his suit alarms becoming distant, then swallowed by the structure. At the shaft stairs, the climb was worse than the descent. Heat rose. Vacuum leaks pulled at our suits in small, invisible tugs. The metal steps were slick. Coil 9's damaged leg made him slow, each step a mechanical struggle. My dosimeter no longer clicked. It had saturated. The display showed a warning and then went blank, as if refusing to quantify what was happening. Halfway up, Coil 9 stopped. His suit brace locked. The hydraulic system had finally lost pressure. He tried to move and couldn't. He leaned forward, helmet touching the wall as if resting. I knew that posture. I had seen it in trenches on toxic worlds, in the aftermath of stim crashes, in men who had decided to stop negotiating with pain. I put my hand on his shoulder brace and tried to shift his load. The suit whined. It could have carried him if the brace hadn't locked. It was a failure of engineering, not will. The shaft lights flickered again. Above, a heavy thud reverberated through the structure, like something collapsing into itself. Coil 9's suit core set a status packet. Life support stable for now. Mobility compromised. Recommended extraction assistance. It was a clean message. We had no extraction assistance. We were the assistants. I looked at the remaining distance to the top. I looked at my suit's oxygen reserve. I looked at the pressure reading, now lower than it had been, meaning the leak was growing. I logged Coil 9's position and status. I logged the time. I logged the fact that leaving him would reduce my exposure and increase the odds that at least one core would make it back to upload. Then I climbed. I did not feel heroic. I felt empty. The system did not reward feeling. At the top of the shaft, the airlock corridor was in chaos. Workers moved in clusters, some guided, some stumbling. Security teams tried to impose lanes. A stretcher rolled past, its occupant covered. The lights were dimmer than before. Power was being rerouted. My suit's external cameras caught sight of the tower through a viewport. The reactor spine still stood, but it had shifted, a subtle lean barely visible. The coolant vapor tumor along its side had thickened, spilling in slow sheets. I crossed the pad toward the shuttle, my movements heavy. My suit filters worked harder, their fans whining. My mouth tasted like copper and bile. My hands trembled inside the gloves, small involuntary movements I could not stop. The shuttle's airlock cycled. Warm air hit my face inside the helmet and made me realize how cold I had been for hours. Warmth should have been relief. It felt wrong. Inside the shuttle, a technician reached for my suit's data port. I connected it. The upload began. The technician's eyes met my visor for a second. There was fear there, not for me, but for what my suit core contained. Fear that data could do what bullets could not, force consequences. My vision blurred at the edges. The suit's internal diagnostics flashed warnings I had seen before in training scenarios. Elevated heart rate, dehydration, early neurological impairment, exposure syndrome. The words were clinical. They described the body as if it were just another system failing. I sat down on the shuttle deck because my legs decided without asking me. My hands rested on my thighs. The suit was heavy. My breathing sounded loud. Through the open inner hatch, I could see the refinery pad and the endless dark beyond. The moon's horizon was a thin curve, dusted with pale ice. Far above, orbit lights moved. Ships, drones, the machinery of a war that would continue regardless of what happened on this frozen rock. The upload finished. A confirmation tone sounded in my helmet. It was small, almost gentle. I tried to stand and couldn't. My body felt like it belonged to someone else, a thing I had carried too long. My tongue was thick. My thoughts were slow and arranged themselves in short, factual lines. We had isolated the buried cavity. We had severed the conduits. We had reduced the risk of crust fracture. That was what the math would say. We had left one engineer wedged in a vacuuming gap. We had left one engineer locked on a stairwell beneath a burning tower. That was also what the math would say. Outside, the tower leaned a fraction more. A tremor passed through the pad. The shuttle's deck vibrated. Somewhere in the refinery, metal screamed as it tore. The technician looked toward the viewport. His face tightened. He did not speak. Nobody spoke. Speech would not change physics. The last thing I remember clearly is the sound of my own breathing, amplified by the helmet, and the sight of metallic snow drifting across the pad lights in slow spirals. The flakes caught the light and glittered. They looked almost beautiful if you ignored what they carried. My dosimeter display was dead. My suit core had done its job. I had done mine. After that, the memory breaks into fragments. A pressure alarm, a flash of red on a monitor, a sudden cold that bit through insulation, and the taste of copper becoming stronger until it was the only taste left. I'm recording this now because the suit core kept a reserve channel open even after the shuttle systems failed. It is still logging. Logging is what it does when it cannot fix. If this file is read, it means someone wanted the truth more than they wanted the story. The metallic snow kept drifting. It always does on a moon like this. The end. The narrative settles, and the world returns to a fortified, peaceful quiet. You're in the safest part of the night now. Let sleep take over.